Great. Thanks for joining us, everybody. For those that were with us yesterday and those that are just joining us today, this is June, which is Policy and Government Relations Month at Emerald Cities. And so we have 3 webinars, one yesterday that addressed federal legislation and specifically workforce, and today and tomorrow, which will look at the utilities industry. So thanks for joining us. I wanted to start just by making a couple of comments. Ann Durkin-Keatings wrote a book. It was entitled The Invisible Network. And in the book, she stresses that local utilities, along with public work, form the essential infrastructure of our daily lives. Without utilities, as she says, we are in the wilderness, and we are wilderness campers, camping out along the urban plateau. So local utilities is everywhere, and we use it in our homes, schools, workplace, and it forms a thread throughout Emerald cities and all our American cities. So today and tomorrow, we're going to concentrate on the utilities industry. Today, our webinar is on Utility Regulation 101 and Utility Energy Efficiency Programs. And tomorrow, we'll focus on local utility policies and how it impacts the average citizen and where you live and throughout the country. So today, we're lucky to have 2 members from the American Council for an Energy Efficient Economy, ACEEE, with us today, Eric Mackres and Dan York. Eric is with us in our studio in Washington, D.C., and Dan is patched in from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, where there's a great deal of politics going on right now. Eric works on local community and energy efficiency initiatives with ACEEE's policy program, and prior to being with ACEEE, Eric worked extensively in the field on environmental and affordable housing policy in the states of Michigan and California. Dan's work at ACEEE focuses on researching, analyzing, and implementing energy-efficient policies and programs, and he has more than 20 years working in public policy. Prior to ACEEE, Dan served as a senior project manager at the Energy Center of Wisconsin. And so again, you know, they've taken time out of their busy schedule to join us, provide us with food for thought, and it should be really engaging. I'll turn it over to Eric.
Thanks, Felipe. I appreciate it. Hi, everybody. I'm Eric Mackres in D.C., and Dan York is also on the phone. We're going to be juggling this a little bit because he's out in Madison, Wisconsin. But so we're going to be talking about utility regulation primarily from the perspective of energy utilities, and we'll be diving in mostly into the work that energy utilities, electric and gas, will focus primarily on electric utilities, the work that they do around providing energy efficiency services through various programs. We're going to talk pretty generally, but there are differences around the country, vast differences, so we'll try to point out some of those as well. Great. So first of all, I want to get a sense of who's on the call, and you know, we're all muted, so I'm not going to make you go around and identify yourselves, but I just want to point out that, you know, just among the 10 Emerald cities, there's a wide diversity of existing kind of utility structures, and also how programs are organized and delivered. So just as a few examples, you know, the most common utility model around the country is the investor-owned utility. So most of the cities have investor-owned utilities. Some of the exceptions include Seattle, who has a municipal utility. And another kind of exception when it comes to energy efficiency is in Portland, in the whole state of Oregon, where energy efficiency programs are primarily delivered through a nonprofit organization for the state as opposed to through the utilities. So we'll dive into a little bit of those distinctions a little bit later, but just to say, it's important to understand your local context. And here are just some of the questions I want you to be thinking about throughout this webinar. And if you haven't already done some research into this, take a look at at the websites of your local utilities. These are important questions for you to answer if you're interested in pursuing and learning more, or helping to develop programs and policies for your area focused on energy efficiency. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Dan to give you a little overview of ACEEE and to talk about the policy context for utilities and energy efficiency.
Great. Thank you, Eric, and I'm delighted to be here. As mentioned, I'm calling in from a state that's a little politically charged today, so it's kind of nice to be addressing a topic that, to me and to ACEEE, we like to think is a very nonpartisan issue, that energy efficiency makes sense for all kinds of both good conservative and liberal reasons. And we really view energy efficiency, as this slide shows, as a bit of a multi-tool that it's a way to address rising customer energy costs. It addresses the costs of buying power on the wholesale markets or to generate it. It's a way to address new resource needs of any type. There's a lot of talk of the need to upgrade and expand transmission and distribution. That's the T&D there. Large-scale transmission lines and more local distribution lines as loads and population shift. There's also ever-increasing environmental objectives thrown into the mix. Reliability is a big deal. I would kind of like to point out that at the dawn of the 21st century, arguably our most high-tech state of California was facing rolling blackouts due to a whole complicated electricity crisis. So that was kind of a wake-up call that we were, as was mentioned in the introduction, that our cities are highly reliant on electricity and other utilities, and electricity is the point where just a sudden loss of power can really destroy some very high-tech production lines and things. And then finally, economic development. Investments in energy efficiency can really stimulate local economies through the jobs. It's pretty hard to outsource somebody to go around doing home weatherization. We've got a lot of industry that is involved with energy efficient products and services. So next slide there, Eric. Is my sound okay? Somebody give me a cue if not. Sorry, I'm not joining you by audio, but you're probably better for it, or by visual, I mean, just by audio. All right, and then here's another basic tenet of the work that ACEEE does is that saving a kilowatt hour or a therm of natural gas is by far the cheapest utility energy resource. That up on this chart is comparing costs of energy efficiency versus producing a kilowatt hour of electricity by a host of different technologies: wind, biomass, natural gas combined cycle, pulverized coal, nuclear, integrated coal combined cycle, integrated gasification combined cycle, solar PV. So what evaluation after evaluation shows of efficiency programs is that you can save a kilowatt hour from anywhere from just about nothing up to 5 cents. On average, the studies that we've done shows it comes in pretty right around the range of 2.5 cents a kilowatt hour to 3 cents a kilowatt hour. Some go higher, especially as we're going to try to capture more of it. We're moving up the cost curve a little bit, but by any measure, that's quite a bargain compared to the producing that kilowatt hour through any other means. So that's really what drives this work, to try to get the utilities involved and investing in their money in energy efficiency, not just new power plants. So next slide there. All right, so we're going to give a whirlwind tour of utility regulation and energy efficiency policy. Next there. All right, so types of utilities and regulation. As Eric mentioned, the dominant model that maybe most of you see is an investor-owned utility, which is a for-profit company that's granted an exclusive franchise, a service territory that's subject to regulation, particularly rate regulation, but a whole host of other investment and operations decisions are governed by regulation, typically the state public utility commissions. But there are also other models. The cooperative utilities, mostly rural co-ops, arose during the electrification days back in FDR's 1930s era. And we've got municipal utilities, as was mentioned. Seattle City Light is a good example of a large city served by a municipal utility. Los Angeles is another one. And in those cases, the municipal utility, some of those can essentially are the aggregator where they pretty much just purchase power and then distribute it and run services for households and businesses in the city. Or some municipal utilities also have generation resources. And in some states, like here in Wisconsin, the small municipal utilities, or actually all the small to large, can band together and form a cooperative by a kind of a joint purchasing organization to get better deals on power and aggregate it for them. And then there's some other publicly owned utilities, most notably some of the large federal power authorities like Bonneville Power and TVA, which are generally are wholesale producers and get it out to supply it to a number of other types of utilities that actually serve the customers. Next, please. And so looking at utility planning and energy efficiency and kind of starting to think about how cities fit into this picture, utilities, as we all know, that involve some very massive infrastructure between large generation plants, the transmission distribution systems. It's really quite an undertaking, and to plan and operate those systems is no small task. It really begins with a load forecast. They've got to be able to figure out what customer demand will be. Then they need to assess their resources. How are we going to meet that? Will we generate, or how much can we generate if we're a generator, or how much do we need to buy on the market? How much might customers supply through things like combined heat and power, renewables? All those things go in the mix. And then if we come up short on that resource portfolio, what options are available to meet demand? Do we go out to the market to provide it, or do we build our own generation? What are the costs? What are the timing? It's no wonder that a large modern power plant can't be built overnight. It can take many years, and so that there's definitely a can be a long time scale, and sometimes you might need resources quicker, so you might have to go to one that can be delivered a lot quicker. Then there's other constraints and considerations that come into planning, clearly environmental regulations and objectives, whether maybe there's not a specific regulation, but many cities I know have adopted greenhouse gas reduction targets, and that might fit into the mix. Reliability, that's typically governed by the system operator of the transmission grid and the wholesale markets, and there's reliability councils around the country that because electricity has to be run and delivered real time, there's always a reserve margin, as it's called, so that there's resources available on the system to provide typically, let's say, 15% above the current demand, so that if some generator was lost, that there's instantaneously another resource available. So that those are subject to some pretty strict technical criteria. And then the transmission distribution capacity. Can we get the power to where it's needed? Transmission lines are limited. You can overload them, and when they're overloaded, they trip out and cause outages. So you have to be able to route the power to where it's needed. And then there's feedback adjustments as the plan moves forward. Next slide, please. What we see with customer energy efficiency programs really have their origins back in the 1970s, and I'm sure some of us are old enough to have remembered those days when we had some of the oil crises and energy first became a public policy concern. There were soaring costs as nuclear power especially was driving up some really rapid cost increases, but other resources were similarly increasing rapidly, both the fuels and the construction costs, and there was the notion of resource scarcity. People started wondering, will we have these resources in 10, 20, however many years? And then the environmental concerns associated with acid rain and water pollution, a whole host of impacts that were really arose that come from our way we produce and deliver power. So along came this kind of what really at the time was a pretty radical notion, and that is of demand-side management. Back before the 1970s, actually that utility planning I mentioned before had been kind of an easier exercise because demand growth was so steady at about 7% per year that forecasting amounted to getting semi-log paper and a straight edge and just predicting that demand's growing at 7% a year, so we just need to build resources to meet that demand, and that's the extent of it. But some wise people started questioning whether this clearly couldn't go on forever, and that maybe there are ways that we can actually manage that demand growth and do things on the customer side of the meter, as we call it, that could reduce demand and reduce energy use. So that idea wasn't a new idea, but it really started becoming applied back in the 70s. And then into the 1980s and 90s, the utility demand-side management really grew and took hold rather quickly just because it very clearly demonstrated it worked. You could, again, this gets back to that saving a kilowatt hour is cheaper than producing it. Plus, you can do things with load management to drop demand. Now, this next chart kind of shows the history of investments in energy efficiency programs through utilities and utility-like programs. Like Eric mentioned, that there are some states now that have non-utility organizations deliver those programs to utility customers. But as you can see, in the early 90s, we were already almost at $2 billion a year in customer energy efficiency programs. And then you'll notice this steep decline there in the late 90s, and that's the era of electric utility restructuring, when in many states they made the decision to kind of break up the conventional vertically integrated utilities and try to introduce more market forces, have wholesale markets operate independent of the distribution and retail services, so that each state, we're left with a kind of a mixed landscape. You all probably are aware of what things are in your state, but if not, do a little checking. It varies quite a bit. Some states have the traditional fully integrated utilities with rate regulation, and others are restructured where the wholesale markets are competitive. And retail too, that was a big drive to try to make retail more competitive. And then to show how this works in operation, in the Pacific Northwest was a long-time pioneer in integrated resource planning, demand-side management, actually as a result of a federal act passed in 1980 as a result of nuclear capacity overbuilding and a whole host of problems that were experienced in the Northwest with conventional ways of planning and operating utilities. They passed the Northwest Power and Conservation Act that really required them to start looking at demand and customer side energy efficiency. And they now have the equivalent of 3,000 megawatts worth of customer energy efficiency in place, which is the equivalent of 3 large baseload plants. When you picture a large nuclear or a large coal unit, that's the big sizes is what we're talking about here. And that's from 1970 to 2005, but they're not content to sit on their heels. they're looking ahead. They're essentially relying on new customer efficiency to meet demand growth, and then a small amount of additional generation needs to be met by renewables. So clearly they're going towards clean and green energy resources. Next slide. And to show another example of how this stuff actually works, California has pretty much flatlined per capita energy use through improved customer efficiency. This chart just very clearly shows how the per capita electricity use for the has continued to creep up, where California, they started getting very engaged in customer energy efficiency back in the 70s and have held demand at a flat rate. Next one, please. There we go. All right, and then this next slide, I think, is just really telling of how far we're taking this, that this slide, even 5 years ago, would have probably been considered heresy in the electric utility world, but the state of Massachusetts and some other leading states are really looking at bending the demand curve down. That is decreasing total electricity use. We've seen just, a forever increase, it seems, in electricity use, and now they're looking at ways to drive that downward, and this is through aggressive energy efficiency. Okay, next one. And the key policy drivers that are really behind customer energy efficiency programs, with that one called integrated resource planning, that's really what we're shown there, that era of the 1980s into the 90s when demand-side management had become prevalent, and demand-side management is that weighing the demand-side options on an equivalent basis to that investment in a supply-side option and pick the one that lowers overall costs. And there are states still very much following this model. Minnesota and others, I know Iowa, a whole host of states still really follow this model, some not necessarily by that name, but essentially it's that idea. But then along has come another policy driver called energy efficiency resource standards, and those are just a specific target for energy savings. They're equivalent to, you've probably heard of renewable energy standards, where there's a target for a certain amount of energy that's to be produced by renewables. For energy efficiency, that's just giving a numeric target. And Eric will go to the next slide here. And this shows the states that have adopted these. And essentially, this is kind of a way to really target energy efficiency specifically. With integrated resource planning, if it's practiced the way it should be, you should wind up with pretty aggressive energy efficiency because it is so cost effective. But I think there was, because of restructuring deregulation, some states kind of lost that process, and there wasn't anything really driving them towards this kind of policy goal. So this kind of rose a bit in response. So they're pretty widespread. Next slide, please. And one thing I'll note while we're changing the slide here is it's these energy efficiency resource standards that can be your ally at the city level, because in these states that have these goals in place, they not only have to reach some more aggressive targets than they probably have had to achieve historically, and in many cases they're increasing savings by 2 or 3 times from what the programs had achieved in the past, but they also have to maintain that. So those utilities are really being stretched, or the non-utility providers, to find more and more savings. And this just shows how they're doing. The savings are denominated usually in a percentage of total retail sales. So this is just saying that in 1 year, they're knocking off 1 to 2% of, they're saving that amount of energy compared to their total retail sales. Okay, next slide. Going to start breezing through a few of these here. There's the case with a lot of the PowerPoint presentations these days. There'll be more material in here than I can probably cover, but that'll be there for reference. So shifting gears a little bit into the utility business models and energy efficiency, there's the fundamental question that always arises, well, why would a utility try to sell less of what it people perceive it that it's in the business of doing, which is selling energy. But because of the regulatory structure and other policies, you can kind of direct things the way they are. And it's been driven by types of utilities, regulatory requirements, and there are ways to align the financial objectives of a utility with goals of saving electricity. They're not mutually exclusive principles. Okay, next slide there. And we talk about 3 legs of the financial stool for utility energy efficiency programs. The utilities, first of all, need to cover those program costs. They have to be picked up and recovered through customer revenues. And then there's this thing called the throughput incentive. That means that the way utilities are traditionally regulated, essentially once rates are set in a rate case, any more sales than that means more revenue. So they've got a very direct motivation to increase sales, and conversely, reducing those sales reduces revenue and profits. And then a third level is that when utilities invest in new power plants, just like they're allowed to earn an investment return, and there's ways to structure that for energy efficiency as well. Okay, next one. And some of the ways, cost recovery, typically most utilities now just expense it. Some had amortized, meaning spreading it out over many years. There's a thing called revenue decoupling, which gets very technical, but it essentially is just disconnecting utility revenues from rates so that there's, you eliminate that throughput incentive, and you can still assure that the utility can recover its costs of operation. And then the shareholder incentives are ways to provide an earning opportunity on those investments and spending on energy efficiency. Next, please. And quickly on this one, just that these financial disincentives, misalignments have always been known, but it's just, especially as we're pushing utilities to do more and more efficiency, and the savings grow and grow, that these effects become much more pronounced. And so to really get utilities to go after all the cost-effective energy efficiency we think are out there, it really needs to be addressed. Okay, next one. And then now switching into the investments and program portfolios. Well, first of all, questions up to this point. I've been kind of talking them out a minute, and any questions that come up either audio or via the pop-up box.
So if you have questions, you feel free to unmute yourself or to put it in the chat box if you can't unmute yourself. Dan just covered a lot, and we'll have a chance to talk more at the end, but wanted to give you a chance if there's anything that's unclear or you have questions up until this point. So, okay, seeing if I see some pop up, I'll keep in mind. Let's keep moving then. Next one. Part 2. All right, and then this map, every year over the past several, ACEEE has come up with our state energy efficiency scorecard, which is a multi-dimensional rating of state policies and programs for energy efficiency, covering not just utility programs, but transportation, state procurement policy, building codes and standards, a host of things. But this quickly kind of summarizes where some of the leading states are when it comes to their energy efficiency policies and programs, and it tends to be the Northeast, a few Midwestern states, the West Coast, the Pacific Northwest, and then the Southwest. There's several states there that have really come on strong lately, and slowly this map has been filling in, which is nice to see. All right, next one. And as we're switching that, just seeing where your state stands is just kind of an indication of how receptive perhaps the utility is to, or how aggressive they are pursuing customer energy efficiency. And this next slide will be a quick one too. Just don't worry about the details. There's no way I know you can read all that, but those are the 50 states laid out. And what's important is that the budget spent on
programs, it varies anywhere from essentially nothing up to the most aggressive state. Vermont is spending about 4.5% of the total utility revenues on customer programs, and and in general, good performance is somewhere 1.5 to 2.5 or 3%. So there's some significant dollars going out here for customer programs. Next slide. And just to put a few more numbers, again, this will be a quick pass, but just nationwide, we see $4.6 billion being spent on programs, and the top 10 states from the last state scorecard are, just in absolute terms, tens to hundreds of millions to, a little over $1 billion being spent per year in California. So that's significant budgets, and that's definitely on the up and up. We've seen pretty steady growth. Then, of course, but spending isn't what you really care about. What you care about is savings, and this slide just again shows the range of savings. Most programs are getting anywhere from 0.5 to 1% savings or more. The most aggressive are getting upwards of 2 or more % per year. Next slide. And then this will be another whirlwind tour through some work that ACEEE has done looking at what we call exemplary programs. It was soliciting nominations nationally on really leading best practice programs. And this just shows that the common elements of good programs. And so, if you're looking at what's available in your area, you can kind of use this as a little bit of a benchmark. But these programs have been around. They've been able to grow, mature, evolve. They are working. Financial incentives are integral and essential elements. That means some kind of customer rebate typically, but sometimes those incentives are directed to retailers or other program contractors that are providing services. Again, that's very cost effective, anywhere from 2 to 4 cents a kilowatt hour. We're seeing a lot of innovation, both within programs and for programs reaching new markets. I know Eric's going to be talking about multifamily programs. That's been an area that's often been underserved for a whole host of good reasons, but that's a customer segment that can greatly benefit from energy efficiency too. And then a lot of these programs really rely on technical experts in the field, those personal relationships, and industry experts. Next slide. And we really see comprehensive program portfolios, everything from residential light bulb programs to very complex industrial audits and technical assistance. And customers typically have many different service options. So really any end use in a home, business, institution, industry, there's probably a program that will address that. And in fact, some of the best programs are really making it, you don't really need to know about which program you're interested in. You just want to talk to kind of a one-stop shop, and they'll figure out how to line things up to assist. There's a lot of long-standing successful programs, but also a lot of really new startup programs. Arizona is an example, and Illinois are a couple states that hadn't had too much in the way of programs for a long time, and then just within the last 2 to 5 years have really come out aggressively. A lot of collaborations. Again, this is where the municipal your organizations and state government or municipal organizations and others can really come to work with utilities. And then a lot of statewide and even regional approaches, especially for certain markets where you really need to affect a much bigger market than just the local one. All right, next one. And just wrapping this up, just Energy Star is big and growing, well established. A lot of programs as they get going, especially want to target what we call lost opportunities. That means you don't want to build in inefficient new buildings that just become tomorrow's retrofit opportunity. So if anything, you focus some of the first efforts on making sure that new things constructed are as efficient as possible. That's codes and standards. And then, again, programs are really looking for deeper savings as they reach higher savings targets. next one. All right, so I'm going to switch it over to Eric now.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. So that's a little bit of the policy and kind of programmatic policy context, and I want to dive a little bit more into how states and utilities develop what their programs are, how do they choose what programs to do, and what are they. So here's an example just so we can put a little bit more life to what we've been talking about. Here's an example of an actual project that was implemented thanks to a specific program. So this is an example from New York State. It's a town in upstate New York. This was a mixed-use building, residential, also had street front commercial, an old building over 90 years old. And what happened through this program, the NYSERDA Energy Smart Multifamily Performance Program, they installed a lot of new equipment. This was focused on equipment change-out to a large extent, boilers for heating, controls for that, for water heating improvements, installation of more efficient appliance, more efficient windows, and lighting. And so through this program, which provided incentives and technical assistance to make these investments in the building, the result was a 27% annual energy savings, which, for this building of 13 residential units and also some shops included, that's a lot of money. And lifetime cost savings there of $40,000, which goes a long way. So that's an example of kind of a project level example of what these programs are doing around the country. This is an example of, from a multifamily perspective, I'm actually going to give mostly multifamily examples that are from a recent report we did on the opportunities for the multifamily sector and utilities to collaborate better. So there's a citation for that at the end if you're interested in reading more about that. Okay, so in terms of developing efficiency program portfolios, and that just simply means, what programs do utilities offer and why, and how do they develop and decide what programs to offer? Well, there's all sorts of ways that it varies across the country, but here's the general idea of some of the choices and some of the variables that states and utilities are looking at when developing these programs. So, as Dan mentioned, the goals that states have set or other regulators have set for their utilities is a huge driver, because those goals in terms of energy savings and other objectives then determine budgets for energy efficiency programs. So the larger the budget, the more energy efficiency you can get, because all efficiency investments, some cost more, some cost less, but there's some sort of investment, whether it's capital or information or other ways that investments are being made. So budgets are important toward getting savings. Obviously, the fuels that are being targeted, electric utilities versus gas utilities versus water utilities, some locations have those all combined into one organization. That's very, very rare. You'll find that in some municipal utilities, but a lot of times utilities are focused just on the specific fuel that they provide. And in terms of targeted sectors and customers, so that's a question of who do utilities serve, who are their primary customers, and what are the needs of those specific customers. Also, economy and climate specific programs, so that means things like, is this a community with a large amount of manufacturing, for example, or is it mostly a residential community? What's the economy? Is it a bedroom? Is it a bedroom community? Is it manufacturing, or is it a service economy? Climate issues in terms of the northeast of the United States is going to be much more interested in heating-focused programs than the Southwest, for example, who would be more interested in thinking about air conditioning as an example. There's a couple other things here that we'll talk about, these incentives versus comprehensive services and measure-specific versus whole buildings. I'll touch on that again in a few minutes. So here's, in terms of designing and prioritizing programs, the typical process of how this works. Again, this varies, but hello, there I am again. Typically it occurs when there's some sort of regulatory event. The way the utilities are regulated is that the rules under which they're governed and their business model works is revisited from time to time. So there's all sorts of different cases and ways that comes up. Here are some examples. Rate cases when utilities need to change their rates, but they're required to ask some sort of regulatory body about that. Rulemakings, these could be things specifically related to the utility commission or regulator wanting to do more about energy efficiency or about something else entirely that energy efficiency could be integrated into. And then also just general planning cycles for demand forecasts and thinking about as the utility does their planning for future demands and things like integrated resource planning, as Dan had already mentioned. So an event like that happens, and if things are set up right, this is also the time when you'll identify what's the sort of efficiency potential available. We can talk a lot more about what this consists of, but basically it's research that identifies here's the amount of energy efficiency that's available in this community and how much of it is actually achievable. The utility will typically propose programs that will identify how much of the achievable savings they think they can get and then how they're going to go after it. The regulatory proceedings will discuss those proposals, comments by experts and stakeholders and others, and then after a lot of back and forth, typically, eventually you'll come up with some approved programs and related budgets for them that can then be implemented. So that's the kind of policy background piece of this, and being aware of where in this process and how this process is happening in your community is pretty important if you're interested in influencing it. So I want to talk briefly, I've got a couple of slides on this, but I'm not going to spend a lot of time on them. I just want to make the point that in terms of programs being chosen, the way that typically works is that it's a pretty economic-centered decision process. There's definitely politics involved, but in most states, there's some sort of cost-effectiveness test that is the primary way that the state and utilities will decide which programs make sense and how they'll all fit together in a larger program portfolio. So basically, this just means, how do the costs and the benefits of efficiency compared to other energy resources like new generation. And as we already talked about, efficiency is cheap, so if the rules are fair, typically efficiency will win out. In some cases, those rules could be improved, and that's one of the things we work on at ACEEE. But there's also a lot of reasonable debate as to how do you actually measure cost effectiveness, and those are things about what test, whose costs are we including, whose costs and benefits are we including, and then also what scale. So are we looking at, does it have to be at the program portfolio level all the way down to a specific piece of technology that you'll install in a building? Which scale does it have to be cost effective, and how that's dealt with differently in different places around the country. So briefly, I'm not going to go through all of these, but here's some of the different cost effectiveness tests that are out there. This is something that can be important in terms of you wanting to make the case for a particular program or a particular way a program be implemented. Understanding what tests are used in your community and how they're used can be very important. So this is for your reference in the future. And these are the same tests shown in a different way, but I always wanted to make a point here that the primary test that's used in a particular state varies considerably. The most common one as a primary test is this total resource cost test. But a lot of states, as shown in the second chart here, will often use multiple tests. So just to kind of weigh the different angles of costs and benefits from whose perspective. So there's more details on this from the report shown at the bottom there. So here's a couple other more wonky things if you want for reference. These are some of the important numbers and calculations that are used in these cost effectiveness tests. I'm not trying to go into this just because it's fun to geek out on, because it's actually not necessarily that much fun. The reason why it's so important is that these are how these decisions get made, and understanding how exactly these calculations are used in your community will make a big difference in your ability to influence what choices are made. So here's an example of how this is applied. So these are some examples of programs from Commonwealth Edison in Illinois. There's residential programs, commercial programs, and then the name of the program. The next column over from the name of the program shows the cost of the total resource cost test. So basically, any value over 1 means that it's cost effective by this test. So all these programs are cost effective. The lowest score here is the 1.04 from the single family home performance, but it's still, because the number is greater than 1, has more benefits than costs. And then the other important number here is this life cycle dollars per kilowatt hour in the next column. And that's just showing the cost of this program when you compare the program to new generation. And then I've shown at the bottom here, and this is from 2010, the average electricity rates in Illinois for the residential sector was 11 cents per kilowatt hour. And if you compare that to the life cycle costs for all of these programs are so much cheaper than providing new energy sources, so as a result, are saving customers money. So that's the deepest stuff I wanted to get into, and I'll try to wrap this up quick so we have a little bit of time for discussion. But this is just showing that typically programs are organized by customer classes, and that means in most places the typical customer classes are residential, commercial, and commercial and industrial combined. Large commercial versus small commercial is a distinction that's frequently made. Programs are designed this way because those are the customer segments that utilities are used to working with. They understand and have different rates typically for different kind of customers, and they typically have relationships in their own organizations designed that way. And the size of these programs vary. Again, that's what I'm showing in these charts here, is that the budgets and savings from programs vary based on the reality of a specific state. So, for example, Arizona has a very residential-heavy program, set of programs, but as we see here, New York has a very heavy commercial and industrial set of programs, and then in terms of where they're getting their savings from as well. There's other customer classes that are typically treated as secondary in utility program design, but are important as well. So things like the low-income sector, agriculture, MUSH, municipal universities, schools and hospitals is the acronym. I know that's an area that a lot of Emerald Cities folks are working in, and an area that utilities have not traditionally treated as heavily, or designed programs as heavily around as they have these other sectors. So here's just an example of one utility and what its program portfolio looks like. So this is just commercial and industrial programs run out of the Eugene Water and Electric Board for Eugene, Oregon. It's just to show you the variety, even within the commercial and industrial sector, the variety of different programs they provide and different services to help to identify all the variety of different needs and opportunities. So one of the problems with this model, and that us and others are working to improve, is that when you have programs that are designed by these very general sector categories, there's often customers that are not served because, for whatever reason, the program is not designed to meet their needs. So here's an example from this multifamily report I mentioned to you about funding for multifamily programs in a variety of states around the country. Multifamily has typically been underserved because it's very difficult as a multifamily building owner, or resident for that matter, to identify which programs would apply to you, because there's characteristics about a multifamily building that are residential but that are also commercial. In some cases they are eligible for both kinds of programs, and in some places eligible for neither. So it's a very complicated environment for someone who's trying to improve the energy efficiency in a multifamily building. And then in the table here I'm showing that even in states that have been leading on a lot of energy efficiency spending, in some cases the spending on multifamily compared to the other residential sectors is underfunded when you look at the number of units that are multifamily versus the number of units that are single-family homes. We're seeing improvements on that, particularly in states like Massachusetts and New York, who've been doing a really good job on that, but a lot of other states need to improve in that area. So one other thing to talk about is programs focused on end uses. And again, I mentioned about how utilities are primarily interested in the fuels that they serve. So electric for electric utilities, gas for gas utilities, and that creates some barriers. But also, programs in themselves are sometimes designed to be focused on particular equipment. And when buildings and their owners or their residents participate in a particular program, but they're only looking at certain end uses, it's easy to miss opportunities for broader improvements, for the whole building approach to improving energy if you're just thinking about particular end uses. So we could call missing the forest for the trees. So as an example of kind of a more traditional program, here's what California has done for multifamily for a long time, and this is a very end-use focused program. They focus on these specific products and how energy efficiency can be improved through improving those products. There's a lot of opportunity in emerging program models that think about this a little differently than these specific, strict kind of sector or customer class programs and end-use programs. Comprehensive programs that are looking at a whole building approach, like I mentioned, and then also comprehensive in the sense that they provide a one-stop shop for customers. They to be able to find all the incentives and all the programs available in one place instead of having to search all around. There's also other opportunities for different administrators and messengers for these programs. So third parties like sustainable energy utilities are growing. Energy service companies can provide services in a lot of cases. Nonprofits and governments are important messengers, and also other program providers. Here's an example of that kind of more emerging model out of Chicago. This is a program run by a nonprofit. They use utility incentives, but because they saw a gap in the services that utilities were providing, they decided, CNT Energy and the Community Investment Corporation in Chicago decided that they would develop these programs to better serve and better provide a one-stop shop for multifamily building owners in the Chicago area. So that's pretty much what I've got. I'd love to take your questions, but I wanted to end on a couple of quick notes. Opportunities to influence utilities, that's something that maybe a number of you are interested in. Talking to your utility directly is almost always the best way to start this. Informal interactions can actually be extremely successful, particularly in places around the country where utilities have goals already in place that they're required to meet. They're often looking for partnerships to help them save these goals. So beginning those conversations and finding out what exactly, what kind of roles you or your organizations can play in helping them to achieve their goals. A lot of them are very open to that. Of course, there's regulatory opportunities as well. Here's a number of examples, different opportunities for thinking about how to get engaged in regulatory actions. Also state legislatures and state policy that happens at the legislative level is different than what's happening at the regulatory level in a lot of cases. And then at the local level, there's opportunities for local governments to often think about how energy efficiency is taken into account when they're negotiating the franchise agreements with the utility that serves them, because the local government has the authority to say that to grant to a particular utility that they will be the ones providing services. So just a couple food for thought items there. Here's a couple of things that I want us to maybe discuss a little bit if we have time, and also things for you to take home and do homework on in terms of next steps in this area. And I want to also point out, here's a list of resources, some of which we've talked about in the webinar already. And if you're interested in further reading on a number of these topics. And then finally, I want to mention that ACEEE is also providing technical assistance on topics related to this over the next year. So we're taking requests for people who are looking for technical assistance, and one of the big things we're looking for is providing assistance in a way that's going to have a large impact and is going to be scalable and innovative. So if some of you are interested in working with us on this, one of the things we just ask is that if there's multiple Emerald cities who are dealing with some of the same issues, putting in an application together or a request together would make a lot of sense. So here's our contact information. Thanks for taking time out of your day to listen to us, and I know we're up against our window in terms of time, but I'd love to take questions if we can.
We got a question over chat from Amy in Boston, and I want to remind everyone that if you hover over the top of your screen where there's a little green bar, you will see the option of unmuting yourself and also the option of sending a chat. So you have both of those options at this time. But I'm going to read a question from Amy that came over chat. And the question is, how do utilities get credit for meeting goals, and how do they get penalized if they don't? What about places with no EERS? Is that something to push for?
I guess I can take a stab at that. They get credit. It's really a review process by the utility. Usually the regulators are overseeing some kind of program evaluation, and it's just a long exercise in reviewing what the programs have achieved, and then they see where they measure up. I had that one slide in there earlier that showed how the overall portfolios were meeting those goals, and so then they can measure up against them. And there are some states do have some types of penalties for not meeting those goals, but the trend is more so that it's by not meeting the goals, there's kind of sending them back to, well, how can we make up the differences that we're, or the areas we're not achieving, and improve the program so that we do achieve them. So the actual requirements varies by states, but there's usually some measure to encourage, and there can be possible penalties, but it's kind of rare to have had to implement them. In some cases, it could be performance, and that's what we like to see, especially is that there's some for those shareholder incentives that they're created such that if the utility meets the goals, they're given a certain level of return on those investments, and if they exceed their goals by a certain percentage, that will increase so that there's a direct financial bonus for meeting them. And then in terms of states, what do you do if you don't have those goals? Well, we had a lot of very good energy efficiency programs achieving some good savings before the advent of energy efficiency resource standards. So even states that don't have those in place typically will have gone through some kind of planning and review process where they've identified the cost-effective potential, as Eric discussed, and they are pushing for them because those investments and that spending is designed to affect that demand. So if they're counting on saving a certain amount of energy through those programs, the regulator needs to make sure that those savings are being achieved, or else they're going to face some kind of shortage perhaps and might have to buy more expensive resources. So there are other hooks. It's clearly not just energy efficiency resource standards, but integrated resource planning is a way that's kind of driven more by that kind of economic calculus of comparing supply and demand options.
Yeah, absolutely. I think Dan's exactly right that we love energy efficiency resource standards because they're a very clean way to promote energy efficiency, but it's not necessarily going to be feasible in every state to have one. So there's a lot of other options that may be appropriate, like integrated resource planning, among other things that can be at least medium-term steps toward pushing your state or your locality to do more.
Or just a quick final comment on that is just I know in Massachusetts you've got the state policy that's really driving aggressive utility energy efficiency by really targeting all cost-effective energy efficiency. So that was a overall state policy goal that's finding its way down to the utility programs.
Yeah, any other questions? Feel free to put it in by chat or to unmute your phone and see if you can talk to us. We'll let you know if we hear you.
And I'd also emphasize, too, while we're waiting for possible, is just, again, Eric and I welcome calls apart from this teleconference, too, if you got some more specific questions.
And I want to remind everybody that the PowerPoint presentation and contact information, as well as a link to the recording, will be sent out on Thursday. So if there are no more questions, then we will conclude here. Sure.
Yeah, thanks. Please let us know if you have questions, and be happy to talk to you more.
Yep. Thank you all.
Great. Thanks, Eric and Dan. So tomorrow we're going to deal with the second half of the conversation that looks at utilities around local policies and some best practices and lessons learned. So thanks for tuning in. We'll get together the same time tomorrow, same site. And thanks again and have a good evening.